Hello everyone. Tonight we start with a subject that the ancient Egyptians took extremely seriously and occasionally, in a very strange way, sex. This culture was more open, inventive, and downright experimental than most people now may be after 2 glasses of wine and a horoscope reading, from religious ceremonies to startlingly candid poetry. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in, but only if you truly like what I do here. It's always interesting to see who is joining us from around the globe, so please let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Let's ease into tonight's voyage together by turning down the lights and possibly turning on a fan to provide a gentle background hum. The Egyptians viewed sex as essential, practical, and preferably free of numerous obstructions, much like plumbing, rather than as a scandal. Sex wasn't concealed behind locked doors, whispers, or awkward euphemisms in ancient Egyptian society. Like the sun rising, the Nile surging, or cats doing what they wanted, it was a natural occurrence. Importantly, no one felt the need to create guilt around it. The gods, farmers, and aristocrats all did it. Sexuality was viewed as sacred in this culture rather than as filthy or hazardous, connected to personal fulfillment, reproduction, health, and creative. This wasn't strictly in that sequence. Balance, not hedonism, was the goal. Ma'at, or cosmic harmony, was the foundation of Egyptian society, and sexuality was a component of that harmony. Crops meant food, which meant survival, and fertility meant crops. Therefore, the gods were most likely pleased if your sexual life was healthy. If not, perhaps it was time to use more honey and burn a candle to Hathor. Art, literature, medicine, and even architecture were all influenced by this open-minded mindset. Fertility gods were carved in temples. Indeed, ancient architects were tactful enough to understand that love doesn't thrive next to granaries, which is why homes were frequently constructed with quiet spaces for intimacy. Furthermore, whether it concerned property issues or someone else's wife, ancient Egypt did not punish people for having sex or worry over celibacy like many later communities did. Mass puritanical movements and intricate hierarchies based on who did or did not do what with whom were absent. The amount of land you had, the quality of your grain crop, and whether or not you kept your linen white in the sun were more important factors in determining your social worth than what you did in bed. The gods, who, to be honest, set the tone by making sex a part of their divine job descriptions, are to be blamed if you're wondering why sex was handled with such casual solemnity in ancient Egypt. First up is Atum, the first solo performer. The Heliopolitan creation myth states that Atum, through an act of, say, joyful self-involvement, created the world. Just unwavering resolve and intergalactic alone time, no partner, no assistance. He created Shu, air, and Tefnut from this, along with human fluids and moisture, meaning that the Egyptian cosmos essentially started with a one-god display. This was cherished, not scandalous. As a divine declaration that life begins with desire, the generative act of the atom was viewed as power. No awkward pause, no fig leaves. The gods were not read. Why should anybody else? The royal couple of ancient Egypt, Osiris and Isis, will be discussed next. Determined and devoted, Isis put Osiris's body back together after his envious brother Set killed and mutilated him. Everything. Almost all, actually. There was one important component lacking. What then did she do? The divine lineage persisted after she used magic to create a substitute phallus and kept him alive long enough to produce Horus. That's great time management and love. The god of male strength and fertility, Min, comes next. He was frequently seen holding his most recognizable feature triumphantly in his hand, topped with lettuce and standing tall in every way. There wasn't much room for imagination in ancient statuary. Symbolizing fertility, ritual lettuce offerings were part of shrines to Min. Additionally, lettuce served as a sort of Viagra for them. Another sensuous image was Hathor, the goddess of music, love, and intoxicated ecstasy. She was frequently portrayed as semi-naked or nude, embodying all the joyous aspects of interpersonal relationships: seduction, laughter, dancing, and yearning. In essence, festivals held in her honor were just old-fashioned feasts with tambourines. Though mainly involving creation through talking or spitting, which is only somewhat less bizarre than Atom's solo performance, even the solar deity Ra had moments of reproductive significance. Sexuality was modeled by the gods as divine, necessary, and perhaps a little experimental. They did not distinguish between the sensual and the sacred. They combined them. Not all Egyptians were making phalluses of magic or presenting the fertility deity with holy lettuce. Between feeding the animals and dodging crocodiles, the majority of them were simply regular individuals with regular relationships who were attempting to find time for intimacy. The average Egyptian had a rather normal romantic life, in contrast to their more theatrical gods and sometimes incestuous aristocracy. It's likely that your love pursuits centered on finding someone who lived close by, made decent beer, and still had all of their teeth by the time you were 30 if you were a farmer, potter, or linen worker. Standards, but sensible. Shared work, shared meals, and, ideally, shared affection were the foundations of relationships. Couples shared a bed, reared kids together, and occasionally wrote a love message on a potsherd. Yes, actual pottery shards bearing phrases like, "I dream of your beauty by night." Folks, that's texting from the past. Priests and political decrees did not control sex. It was your business as long as it was mutually agreeable and did not conflict with your job or another person's marital commitment. Intimacy was valued despite the lack of privacy, the flimsy walls, and the constant presence of curious neighbors. Physical affection wasn't concealed for many couples. Tomb paintings occasionally depicted spouses and wives standing face to face, holding hands, or caressing tenderly, but not in a purely ceremonial manner. These were individuals who truly appreciated interpersonal relationships. The Egyptians had a sense of timing as well. Fertility was important, a great deal. The seasons of crops, the Nile's predictable flooding, and the human body all have seasons. Everybody had at least one grandmother who gave them unsolicited advice on honey and onions, men had herbal tonics, and women were aware of their cycles. Although it wasn't perfect, contraception was a must. Midwifery was the same. Barley and emmer seeds were even used in pregnancy tests. Congratulations if they grew after being peed on, otherwise perhaps next year. Divorce was also an option if romantically things didn't work out. No public humiliation, no trials, only a return to separate bread ovens and a division of property. You might want to dial it back if you're picturing weddings in ancient Egypt complete with veils, bouquets, and awkward uncles performing the crocodile dance. A great deal. As a matter of fact, marriage was blissfully easy in ancient Egypt. A house, bread, and tolerance for one another were all you needed. It also didn't hurt to share a bed. No priest, no registry office, no ceremony, no 47-plate catering menu with lamb, chicken, or delicious mystery stew. Society regarded two people as married if they decided to live together and shared resources such as food, bedding, and possibly a goat. As simple as that. Completed. Not even wedding gowns. Women wore the same linen clothes every other day. They were always breathable, mostly white, and occasionally pleated. No vows, no rings, and no tearful groomsmen reading speech scrolls. Relationships in ancient Egypt did not require fanfare. They required pragmatism. After all, you have tasks to complete. The barley will not thresh on its own. However, especially in later eras, couples did occasionally draft marriage contracts. These prenuptial agreements were essentially archaic. What is brought into the house by whom? What if things go wrong? Who keeps it? Sometimes the contracts even specified sanctions for misbehavior. You owe me silver if you hit me. Very effective, but not romantic. Additionally, the marriage contracts upheld women's rights, which ancient Egypt was very progressive about. Women were allowed to possess property, file for divorce, and sue their ex-husbands for any amusing behavior. Egyptian law was certainly not blind, even if love was. Except for collapsing after a large feast and praying that no neighbors overheard the fun, there wasn't really a honeymoon. However, it was evident that closeness, love, and friendship were prized. Marriage was a partnership, not only a business deal, ideally. Let's move on from this now. Faithfulness was important to the ancient Egyptians, especially in theory. In reality, things were somewhat more lenient, especially if you were powerful, affluent, or had strong justifications. Like many other societal evils, adultery wasn't originally illegal. For the average person, it was less of a legal catastrophe and more of a reputational risk. People would talk about you if you were found cheating, quite loudly, in verse, most likely. However, the government wasn't hurrying to put an end to your misadventures unless it directly harmed someone's livestock or inheritance. However, the social, financial, and even legal repercussions could be more severe for married women who are detected in adultery. Although patriarchal, Egyptian society was not overtly so. Furthermore, issues of paternity, inheritance, and a woman's reputation as someone who didn't stir up trouble during harvest season were frequently linked to her faithfulness. Particularly in affluent homes where upholding family honor was a full-time job, accusations of infidelity may result in divorce, public humiliation, and in rare instances, punishment like beatings or exile. On the other hand, men were more flexible. An unmarried lady having sex with a married man, dismissed most of the time. Another married woman with a married man? That was a headache, particularly if the other spouse was significant and didn't want to share. No century has ever seen the end of jealousy. The importance of having a good reputation and moral standards are mentioned in New Kingdom texts. While some tales portray adulterers as stupid or dishonorable, others predict that a man who has an affair with another man's wife would suffer a terrible end, typically one that involves curses, impotence, or jackal-headed gods. However, it is instructive that most times did not have strong prohibitions against adultery. It didn't seem necessary for the Egyptians to enact laws for everything. They depended more on gossip, humiliation, and the sporadic passive-aggressive lyrics of songs. It performed approximately as well as one might anticipate. The divorce process wasn't too difficult if cheating caused a marriage to fail. Property would be divided and everyone in the society would act as though they weren't interestedly observing. Usually, children stayed with the parents, especially if they were small. What happens if you are initially appalled to learn that Egyptian pharaohs wed their sisters? You're not by yourself. The majority of contemporary people react similarly. However, sibling marriages between royalty were not only accepted but anticipated in ancient Egypt. Is it romantic? Not at all. Is it political? Of course. You must think like a pharaoh to comprehend this custom that raises eyebrows. Let's say you think your family is literally derived from the gods, not in a symbolic, divine right way. It goes without saying that the royal family should marry their siblings if the gods did so, in order to preserve cosmic order. Because awkward family reunions that also double as wedding parties are the epitome of perpetual stability. This was about consolidating power, not about attractiveness. Even noble people were not allowed to ascend to the throne by pharaohs. In-house assets and a pure bloodline were maintained by marrying a sister or half-sister. In essence, dynastic trust concerns and heavenly mythology were the foundation of royal Egypt. This custom was observed by some of the most well-known pharaohs. For instance, contemporary DNA study has verified that Tutankhamun was born within a brother-sister connection, and things didn't work out well, spoiler alert. Tut's multiple congenital conditions, such as a clubfoot and a weakened immune system, may indicate that there are repercussions for repeatedly reciting the family tree. Commoners, meanwhile, were not following this pattern. Like rational, functioning individuals, the majority of ordinary Egyptians got married outside of their familial families. While brother-sister partnerships were reserved for the people with gold masks and burial boats, cousin marriages did occur infrequently in remote places. The habit may cause issues even among royals. Although it was customary for Cleopatra to marry her brothers in plural when she ascended to the queen, she reigned primarily by herself and eventually allied herself with men like Mark Antony and Julius Caesar, who were fortunately unrelated to her. The entire idea looks strange to us, and it is really medically foolish. However, it was only tradition clothed in God-complex reasoning to the elite of ancient Egypt. Even at the expense of diversity in the royal gene pool, heavenly bloodlines had to remain divine. Unless you've seen the Turin erotic papyrus, you're technically correct if you think that all ancient Egyptian art consisted of serious statues, rigid stances, and unending profile views. Then you see that they have incredibly detailed anatomy and jokes. Egyptian art was not immune to cheekiness despite its reputation for restraint, austere pharaohs, placid gods, and perfectly symmetrical profile portraits. After all, having sex wasn't forbidden. Thus the painters would sometimes stop carving falcons and begin drawing something a little more animated. The Turin papyrus, which is being hidden away in an Italian museum like a dirty secret, is the most notorious example. It is thought to have been written around 1150 BCE and features detailed scenes rather than ambiguous allusions to mythology. There are explicit depictions of both men and women, including a man who is either displaying off or symbolically balancing acrobatically on amphorae. Whether it was erotica, satire, or a mix of the two is up for contention among academics. Some believe it was intended as entertainment, perhaps even as a bachelor's present for a person with dubious taste. Others argue that it was a spoof, a creative prank that made fun of people's obsession with virility, fertility, and big wigs. With this exception, the majority of Egyptian erotic art was symbolic rather than overt. Kama Sutra frescoes were absent from temples. They featured holy imagery, fertility motifs, and sporadic nudity that symbolized divine femininity, rebirth, or creation. Fertility deities like Min and goddesses like Hathor were frequently depicted in their undies, albeit in a respectful manner. If you catch the drift, Min, for example, is always seen carrying his distinctive symbol like a divine badge of honor while standing proudly. Then there are the marginal drawings that use humor and sensuality, such as animals acting like people, exaggerated motions, flirtatious tiny side doodles on workers' ostraca, and the usage of limestone flakes as sticky notes. Doodling in your notebook while the foreman was not looking is the ancient equivalent. In Egyptian art, eroticism was not intended to cause scandal. It was just another aspect of life, often jovially extravagant, frequently ritualized, and occasionally glorified. These individuals weren't suppressed. They simply had a great sense of boundaries, and sometimes they felt that the scroll needed some flavor. Think again if you think that ancient love poetry is made up of rigid, chiseled metaphors like "your beauty is like a grain silo." Despite carving hieroglyphs into stone, the Egyptians were not rigorous in their romantic writing. These folks were skilled at flirting, with elegance, with ink, and sometimes with no chill at all. Egyptian love poems, which are mostly from the New Kingdom period, around 1300 BCE, have been preserved on papyri and broken pottery shards because nothing says eternal love like a repurposed cereal bowl. They are refreshingly honest, surprisingly passionate, and sometimes so steamy that you'd think they were written during a Nile flood with nothing better to do. This is an actual quote from one. At home, I'll lie down and act like I'm ill. You will then visit me and I will recover if you are close to me. This is flirtation with a strategy, not nebulous romanticism. These poems, which were frequently written in the first person, were written by both men and women. For the ancient world, that is uncommon. A young woman in Egypt might tell of the excitement of snooping over the lotus pond. Her voice was superior to beer, and a young man could wax poetry about it. Devotion like that is worthy of a monument. Nor were these private journal entries. Some were read aloud for courtship, entertainment, or simply to cover awkward pauses between harp solos. Others were played at banquets. Imagine old-fashioned Tinder dates that included the metaphors wine and possibly a goat roast after passionate stanzas were read aloud. They really went all out. Sensuality was represented by fruit. Hunting entailed seduction and chase. While gardens and rivers weren't just for farming, these poetry were unafraid to combine admiration on a cosmic level with grounded earthly affection. Desire should not be suppressed. Rather, it should be expressed through song, writing, and perhaps even recitation by that one relative who reads too slowly. You most likely think of wine, oysters, or chocolate when you think of aphrodisiacs, not salad. When someone offered you a bunch of lettuce in ancient Egypt, however, they weren't considering fiber. They were making out. In particular, they were calling upon the might of Min, the fertility deity of Egypt, who was closely linked to romaine lettuce for equally symbolic and dubious reasons. Indeed, romaine, it's not your typical Caesar garnish. This was holy stuff. Why? Well, Egyptian lettuce stood erect and exuded a milky white sap when cut, in contrast to the floppy-leafed kind we throw in depressed lunch plates these days, and nothing would elicit such strongly suggestive divine symbolism if that didn't. When ancient priests saw that, they remarked, that's definitely the epitome of male strength. Of course, Min was frequently served lettuce as part of reproductive rites. His statues usually showed him holding a lettuce stem in one hand and his distinguishing trait in the other, as if he were alert. For ages, art historians have been fascinated by that combination. Worshippers would bring bundles of lettuce to his temple during fertility festivals in the hopes of winning his favor for a good pregnancy, more virility, or simply a little love luck. Min was essentially the dating app algorithm of ancient Egypt. If you worship him properly, your chances may increase. Curiously, there is proof that the lettuce was also thought to have therapeutic benefits, especially in relation to enhancing sexual health. The symbolism endured regardless of whether it truly worked or merely resulted in cleaner breath before a date. Furthermore, this wasn't a fad, as if to ask, please make sure I continue to enjoy pleasure in the afterlife and maybe pack a salad. Lettuce can be found in tomb offerings, artwork, and hieroglyphics. It is important to remember that nature symbolism was quite popular with the ancient Egyptians. Their spiritual beliefs were reflected in the material world, from the daily cycle of lotus blooms to the life-giving floods of the Nile. Therefore, when a vegetable begins to function a certain way, the ancient Egyptians used creative, medicinal, and often frightening means to avoid getting pregnant. Lacking access to contemporary science, they depended on natural resources, acquired knowledge, and writings such as the Ebers Papyrus, which dates to approximately 1550 BCE and is among the oldest surviving medical records. Crocodile dung was one of the more notorious remedies. This mixture was combined with sourdough and honey and administered vaginally as a barrier contraceptive method. Although contemporary readers might shudder, the concept was not wholly illogical. Most likely, the mixture produced an obstructive or acidic environment. It's unknown if it was successful. It's easier to guess if it was unpleasant. The use of acacia gum, a plant extract that has been shown to ferment into lactic acid, a substance that does in fact have spermicidal properties, was more promising. It created a sort of early pessary when mixed with other ingredients like honey and dates. One of the few traditional treatments that might pass a very forgiving clinical trial is this one. According to these techniques, Egyptian women actively managed fertility despite having significant legal and medical agency at the time. Midwives, healers, and women in the home would have been familiar with the usage of these products. Ritual and spiritual methods were also used. In an attempt to conceive or postpone conception, women may invoke fertility goddesses such as Isis, Hathor, or Bez. As was common in most facets of Egyptian society, the distinction between medicine and religion was blurred by the employment of incantations and magical amulets in addition to practical treatments. Egyptian medical writings include advice on how to cure infertility, induce menstruation, and even identify pregnancy early by exposing barley and emigranes to urine, a technique that can be surprisingly accurate in some situations. Without the use of contemporary instruments, these customs demonstrate a society that is very interested in comprehending and affecting the human body. They had no intention, but they did not have microscopes. Fertility depended on economics, heavenly favor, life, and death. Even while some of their tactics may appear absurd today, the motivation behind them to prepare, to plan, to protect is quite similar. Virginity was not a social currency, a mark of honor, or a delicate family legacy that needed to be protected at all costs in ancient Egypt. In reality, it was really a minor detail in the larger story of life, which was mostly about inheritance, agriculture, and avoiding upsetting the gods before breakfast. The word virgin, in the ceremonial, moralistic sense, does not exist in Egyptian. Terms like young woman or uninitiated, which denote a less pure culture and more a lack of time, are the closest you'll find. There were no rituals, no torches, no mothers-in-law examining linens as if they were searching for counterfeit money. The Egyptians' much more practical approach to sex was the reason for this, not that they were scandalous libertines. Like eating bread or avoiding hippos, it was accepted as a necessary aspect of existence. Yes, it is important, sometimes sacred. However, nothing that needed a temple priest's stamp on a purity certificate. Value for women was determined by factors like as fertility, loyalty, and the ability to manage a home without the roof catching fire. Her past sexual encounters, her business mostly. Sealing a chaste deal was not the goal of marriage. The goal was to establish a trustworthy partnership that would hopefully withstand plagues and tax season. There was, of course, modesty. Although papyrus scrolls were not used to advertise conquests, the ritual concern with virginity that was prevalent in later societies simply did not exist here. No dowries based on moral performance, no cloistering. No clumsy uncles preaching about virtue. The entire purity panic was not well supported by Egyptian religion either. Hathor, the goddess of wine, music, and love, was blatantly sensuous and utterly unconcerned about what other people thought. The gods were too preoccupied with overseeing creation and maintaining cosmic equilibrium to consider who was responsible for what, when, and with whom. Virginity in ancient Egypt was ultimately viewed as a transient state rather than a permanent resume. To be honest, they were more interested in determining whether your father had a stable roof to provide and who could make decent bread, because you rapidly learn what important and what doesn't when you live in a desert with crocodiles all around you. Not only did ancient Egyptian civilization not celebrate parades or issue rainbow flags, but it also didn't appear to be very concerned about same-sex relationships. There were no public stonings, no official statutes denouncing them, and, most telling of all, no frantic temple sermons about how two men sharing a bedroll would bring civilization to an end. To put it briefly, they were aware but not alarmed. Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep, two senior officials interred in the same tomb in Saqqara, are the most talked about example. Embracing touching noses, a move akin to a kiss, and overall acting like a couple whose biggest dispute was likely over linen colors, Their tomb is decorated with romantic artwork. They are described in the inscriptions as overseers of the manicurists, which seems harmless until you consider that they were obviously close enough to be buried together as a single household. Were they in love? Do your roommates have extraordinary boundaries, unusual fondness for holding hands among brothers? Although there is ongoing discussion among scholars, the visual language strongly favors a loving or at least intensely affectional bond, and the existence of their lavishly decorated, publicly exposed tomb shows that no one was angry. Even in death, they seemed to be appreciated, valued, and free to be who they were. Egyptian mythology and literature also provide for flexibility. Some deities are portrayed as androgynous or intersex, such as the god of the Nile, Hapi. In legendary stories, some people adopt many roles or change their gender without raising issues with heavenly HR. It appears that neither the gods nor the people who invoked them were constrained by human categories. Nevertheless, there is no proof of planned same-sex unions or governmental acceptance of same-gender partnerships. Egyptians were practical. It was fantastic if a partnership resulted in stable property and heirs. If not, well, it was the business of your household. As usual, intimacy was handled with a curious blend of normalcy and privacy. Female same-sex relationships are nearly non-existent in the records, not because they didn't occur, but rather because Egyptian scribes had the annoying tendency to overlook what women did when men weren't present. Having offspring was not just desired in ancient Egypt, it was a spiritual obligation, a social expectation, and, if you were fortunate, a means of guaranteeing that your tomb offerings would be replenished long after you passed away. Therefore, a couple's infertility was not dismissed. In the same afternoon, it was studied from a medical and magical perspective, and occasionally from both. The ancient Egyptians had a pragmatist attitude to infertility. Their medical papyri contain comprehensive diagnosis, remedies, and techniques for assessing female fertility, especially the Cajun gynecological papyrus, which dates to approximately 1800 BCE. In addition to charting cycles and checking cervical mucus, there were instructions for a crude pregnancy test that involved peeing on barley and emmer wheat. Congratulations if the grain sprouted, a Lauda home was on the horizon. If not, the next step could be to inject herbal concoctions, fumigate the womb, yes, that is true, or appeal to higher forces because in Egypt, magic was always available and frequently advised if medicine didn't work. An important part was performed by amulets. They were worn, carried, or set beneath pillows as representations of Hathor, Isis, Bez, or Tauret, the hippo-shaped guardian of childbirth. Figures were cradled or buried, and spells were spoken. According to one source, a lady should recite a protective charm while drinking a mixture of ground dates, honey, and carob in order to become pregnant. Very sincere, but not FDA approved. Although relatively fewer papyri bother to question their reproductive contributions, men were certainly not off the hook. A man may be advised to seek a priest's assistance, perform purification rites, or, in less formal terms, just put in more effort if he is unable to conceive. Additionally, cosmic order, or ma'at, was always a factor because this was Egypt. Although a childless couple can be viewed as imbalanced or even cursed, they were not shunned by society. It provided hope, cures, and some very inventive medicines. It's worth emphasizing that despite all this effort, Egyptian households weren't always bursting with children. Fertility became even more sacrosanct and its absence even more personal as a result of high infant mortality, sickness, and starvation, which kept family sizes below optimal. The ancient Egyptians would have preferred a message and perhaps a well-carved offering slab if you believe that desire wanes after death. They did not consider death to be the end. It was an extension of life, ideally complete with all the pleasures, conveniences, and everyday activities of the living world, including sexual relations. The deceased presumably wanted to transfer their appetites into the afterlife, not just for bread and beer, but also for love, contact, and intimacy, according to funerary literature, tomb inscriptions, and burial gifts. Because really, if eternal life doesn't involve pleasure, what good is it? Not merely for sentimental reasons, but also as a spiritual blueprint, tomb art frequently featured couples standing close together, holding hands or embracing. These were intentional messages to the gods, not just stock poses. Please bring back our love, our bodies, and if you can, our ability to sleep. Indeed, the restoration of the body was a major worry. The deceased are promised that their limbs will work, that their hearts will be fairly weighed, and that their, say, equipment will be restored undamaged in the book of the deceased and other mortuary literature. Even the idea of reviving specific anatomical features is mentioned. For eternity, no detail was deemed too intimate. Rebirth was associated with sexuality. Before giving birth to Horus, the god Osiris was resurrected, complete with a rebuilt phallus after being famously dismembered and put back together by Isis. This myth served as a model rather than merely a narrative. The rest of us ought to re-establish our intimacy if the gods did. In the field of reeds, the Egyptian equivalent of paradise, some tomb inscriptions even asked the gods for a husband and wife to continue their love. It was imagined to be a beautiful, romanticized representation of life on earth, eternal plenty, serene lakes, fertile land, and obviously space for romance. The Egyptians included sex easily into their beliefs about the afterlife, although contemporary societies frequently categorize it as earthly and mortal. It wasn't forgotten or humiliating. Along with food, music, and never having to pay taxes again, it was another aspect of the soul's well-being. They ultimately hoped for what the majority of people still do: solace, company, and a little happiness, even if it required a few magical scrolls and mummification to get there. Naturally, when we metaphorically peel aside the linen wrappings of ancient Egypt, we see a society that did not view the human body as something repugnant, sinful, or suspicious. It was regarded as being strong, natural, and able to satisfy both very human desires and divine creation. For the Egyptians, having sex was not a secret. It was a reality that was written about in poetry, portrayed in art, often in striking detail, and woven into the very mythology that influenced their worldview. Throughout the Nile, gods themselves fell in love, courted, wooed, and sometimes created fertility-related mayhem. In a civilization where existence flowed from cycles, the flooding of the river, the return of the sun, the regeneration of the soul, sexuality was part of that rhythm, not a disruption of it. They adopted a pragmatic stance as well. The Egyptians confronted physicality head-on, frequently with greater clarity than many societies that emerged centuries later, in everything from love songs and afterlife wishes to reproductive treatments and contraception. There was only a clear understanding, no frenzied legislation, no moral panic, and no need for awkward censoring written in the margins of holy scriptures. Bodies do things, people feel things, and the world keeps turning. They didn't overthink it, which is important. Sex was neither dragged through the mud nor elevated. It was respectable, but not encircled by neurosis. It was a component of family, love, health, and occasionally religion. Even their everlasting and mighty gods were not afraid of closeness or bodily form. Indeed, they were its embodiment. We're looking at you, crocodile dung, even though not all of your practices are still relevant today. The mindset is nevertheless pleasantly contemporary, or maybe it has only taken 3,000 years for modernity to catch up. Perhaps it is the legacy that should be remembered. A society that managed to construct pyramids on top of everything while not demonizing desire or fearing the body. It was August 24, 1814, and Washington, D.C. was burning. As British soldiers set fire to the most important structures in the fledgling republic, the Capitol, the Treasury, the War Office, and the President's Mansion, which would later be known as the White House, columns of flames strangled the night sky. With no organized opposition, the redcoats moved through the city almost carelessly while flames licked the rooftops. The capital was helpless, hardly even a teenager in political years. The humiliation was complete. America reddened with embarrassment while the rest of the world watched in shock. But you have to look back a little to see how things got this terrible. Confident and full of big illusions, the United States had declared war on Great Britain 2 years prior. The Americans believed that the war would be quick and spectacular, that they would invade Canada, destroy the British, and at last gain international recognition. After all, Britain was already spent battling Napoleon in Europe. They wouldn't have the stamina to put up with a tenacious former colony behaving rough, surely. They were mistaken. In addition to the invasion of Canada's disastrous failure, the US Navy's limited victories were unable to compensate for the series of land losses. The situation was exacerbated by political differences within the United States. Some states didn't desire the conflict at all. The British never forgot, the supplies were scarce, and the strategy was unclear. Napoleon was vanquished by 1814, and Britain's calendar was clear. Now that they had veteran forces at their disposal, they focused entirely on the other side of the Atlantic, and they were prepared to deliver a message that would be ingrained in the American consciousness for many decades to come. Washington, D.C. wasn't solely targeted for military reasons. It served as a metaphor, the seat of power, the Republic's pride. And because no one truly thought the British would dare strike it directly, it was left virtually defenseless on that muggy August day. The irony, they didn't just dare, they meticulously planned it. It was not a battle that took place, it was a torch-lit parade of revenge, a reminder that the British Empire could still disgrace its former colonies in spite of the revolution. And America was forced to confront a difficult choice as smoke clouded the Capitol dome and flames consumed the House of Representatives. Had they misjudged the empire they had once opposed? It was no accident that the British showed up in Washington. Because the Americans essentially opened the door for them, their journey to the capital was surprisingly simple. Their landing destination was Benedict, Maryland, a small village on the Patuxent River. From there, over 4,500 soldiers, many of them were veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, marched into Washington under the command of seasoned British Major General Robert Ross. Furthermore, it wasn't a last-ditch effort to enter hostile terrain. No, it resembled a Sunday trek more. Why? Since the Americans hardly made an effort to stop them. The administration and President James Madison were aware of the British approach. They had time. Warnings had come from scouts and even citizens. However, the defense was slow and disorganized due to bureaucracy, indecision, and just wishful thinking. In a moment of genius-level denial, Secretary of War John Armstrong Jr. said that the British would not dare assault Washington. "They'll repeatedly go for Baltimore," he said. You guessed it, they didn't. Brigadier General William Winder was the man in charge of stopping the British advance. Regretfully, Winder excelled at drafting reports rather than commanding troops. His hurriedly gathered defense force was made up of militiamen, many of whom were allegedly intoxicated, ill-trained, and unruly. He had too few professional soldiers. Winder paused worse. He kept retreating back instead of digging in, unsure where the British would strike. Just northeast of Washington on August 24th, the two troops ultimately clashed at the Battle of Bladensburg. American forces outnumbered the British, but that didn't matter. The conflict was a complete failure. Soldiers disbanded and rushed away before shooting. Some just ran, dropping their weapons. After spending a brief time on the field, President Madison made the sensible decision to avoid dying among the amateurs. Stunned by how simple the win was, the British pushed on. No burning barricades, no trenches to conquer, and no last-ditch capital defense. The metropolis was just a straight shot away. Nobody was laughing, even though it was a comedy of errors. The American leadership had collapsed into anarchy by the time the British arrived in Washington. Madison escaped. Carts were being filled with official documents. First, Lady Dolly Madison packed up valuables, including the now famous picture of George Washington by Gilbert Stuart, because she would not leave the White House without honor. The match was about ready to be lit as the redcoats marched in as night fell. Washington was all but abandoned by the time the British arrived. The politicians had run away. It was unusually silent in the streets. Only the gentle crackling of fires already burning from previous clashes and the boots of British soldiers could be heard. Admiral George Cockburn and Major General Robert Ross commanded their troops with clinical accuracy. Just a focused purpose to make a statement. No looting, no mayhem. And it was quite a statement. The Capitol building was the first target for the British troops. Although it was still being built, the chambers of Congress, the North and South wings, were finished enough to represent the pride and role of the American government. Both wings were burned by the British. The Library of Congress was on fire. The manuscripts and books, some of which were priceless, were destroyed by fire. It was more than just a military strike, it was a cultural one. They then relocated to the White House, which was referred to as the President's Mansion at the time. Dolly Madison had already escaped, but not before retrieving that now iconic image of George Washington. British troops found the building unoccupied, but dinner was laid out on the table, undisturbed. In what could be history's most embarrassing lunch, British officers sat down and enjoyed the President's dinner before torching the building. They were deliberate, almost ceremonial, in the damage. Cockburn, who had a personal score to settle with the Americans for mocking him in political cartoons, reportedly made a point of burning the offices of anti-British newspapers and even stood atop the Speaker's chair in the House of Representatives, declaring mockingly, "Shall this harbour of Yankee democracy be burned? Yes, it will." Building after building was set on fire over the period of 2 days. The War Department, the Navy Yard, the Arsenal, and the Treasury. To stop counterattacks, even the bridge over the Potomac was set on fire. However, some sites were left unaffected despite the thoroughness. The Patent Office, for instance, was maintained because one brave American, William Thornton, convinced the British that it served all mankind, not just the US government. The destruction wasn't random. It was intended to humiliate and was a surgical procedure. The British had no intention of capturing Washington. Their goal was to disgrace it, and the more buildings that burned down, the louder their message became. This wasn't just a raid. The smoke would persist long after the ashes had been extinguished, and it was a punishment. Something odd occurred just as the British were becoming comfortable with their raging conquest of Washington. The sky grew dimmer, the wind increased, then the thunder struck. A tremendous, bizarre storm, what some subsequently dubbed a hurricane, crashed into the capital. Nature seems to have decided that the city had endured enough hardship. Many of the flames that the British had started were put out by the torrential rain that fell. Strong winds even lifted artillery off the ground and tore building roofs off. According to reports, flying debris crushed a British soldier. As the storm intensified, British officers started to worry that it was a punishment from God for burning a helpless city. Then, almost foretellingly, a tornado tore through the center of Washington, D.C. A real tornado indeed. Carts and debris were thrown like matchsticks as it ripped through the town center. Trees broke in two, buildings fell, and British soldiers were flung to the ground, scared and disoriented. This was a strong indication to the British command, which was already getting preparations to go. They had received their message. Staying longer could be a recipe for disaster. The following day, with their goal accomplished and their boots just beginning to dry, they pulled out of the city. The storm was both a boon and a bane for Washington. On the one hand, it exacerbated the devastation by destroying already damaged buildings and filling the streets with water. However, it contributed to putting out the fire and might have saved the city from total devastation. The British presence was actually wiped away. This storm became almost legendary in the minds of many Americans. It was deemed a divine intervention by clergy. The hand of Providence was commended in editorials. When man failed to defend the capital, even seasoned soldiers whispered that God had intervened. Nature, of course, is impartial. Although the storm did not rebuild the city or bring back the lives lost, it was a symbolic turning point. The British had left, the fires had been extinguished, and what was left was still American. Smoking ruins, sticky ash, broken pride. The storm turned into a peculiar form of deliverance. In the absence of military might, Washington had been spared something else, something unpredictably unpredictable, unmanageable, and possibly redemptive in its own right. The worst was over, but restoring a country's soul. And that was only the start. The storm had passed, the fires had been extinguished, and the British had departed, but what they left behind was more than just debris and ash. It was psychological destruction. Washington, D.C. was in ruins. It was a blackened shell of a capital. All that remained of the president's mansion was a charred shell. The contents of government buildings were either burned or dispersed after they were looted. The devastation felt to many Americans, particularly those in the capital, like a second revolution, although this time the enemy triumphantly marched through. A terrible question confronted the country. Should the capital continue to be Washington? Many thought it was over. The reasoning appeared to be sound. Constructed in a swampy area of nowhere to placate southern states, Washington has always been a compromise. It now appeared to have been a failure experiment after being humiliated and burned to the ground. Relocation was advocated by certain members of Congress. Baltimore, New York, or even Philadelphia may provide greater service. Cities that have real defenses and maintain their dignity. Others, however, resisted. A resolute President James Madison was one of them. He fled the city during the attack, but he soon returned, determined to not allow the humiliation to continue. His wife, Dolly, who had come to represent grace in the face of criticism for saving national treasures, accompanied him. They all demanded that the city would rise once more. Funds were limited, morale was lower, and reconstruction was sluggish. Initially meeting at the Patent Office, Congress eventually moved to the old brick Capitol, a temporary brick structure. Lawmakers were reminded of what had been lost at each session. However, something unexpected had been triggered by the burning of Washington. Decide. Workers, artisans, and common people all contributed to the city's restoration. Once more, the Capitol grew, brick by brick. Benjamin Henry Latrobe, the architect, came back to supervise the repair. His designs featured enhancements, more robust materials, and more ambitious ideas. In order to conceal the burn scars, the president's residence was also repaired and subsequently whitewashed. It got its now famous moniker, the White House, for this reason. Instead of being abandoned, Washington came to represent American perseverance and the idea that a republic can survive and recover even when it is completely humiliated. Even while there were still emotional and visible scars, they solidified into resolve. Washington wasn't going anywhere because a country's actual capital is its beliefs, not its physical structures. In addition to being a blow to architecture, the burning of Washington also damaged the nation's reputation. Many Americans had, until then, considered the War of 1812 to be a misguided sideshow, a political blunder cloaked in patriotic clamor. However, the nation awoke when British troops set fire to the Republic's center. People all along the East Coast were in a state of panic. What city was safe if the capital could fall so easily? Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York even. The conflict suddenly seemed very real, very near, and very dangerous. Once divided, public opinion started to solidify. It started to feel almost treasonous to make the old Federalist claims that the war was needless and badly handled. Now even President Madison's detractors had to concede that the days of arguing were past. The nation had to react after being smacked across the face. Local defenses were strengthened and militias were summoned. In particular, Baltimore prepared for what many believed to be the next British target. People prepared their harbour guns, constructed fortifications, and dug trenches. Not only had the British set fire to Washington's buildings, but they had also set fire to Americans' hearts. But it was defiance, not fear, that spread. Newspapers carried scathing articles demanding retribution. Preachers thundered about divine justice from pulpits. Artists turned tragedy into a form of folk heroism by producing powerful images of burning buildings and Dolly Madison. A tale of perseverance rather than defeat emerged from the ashes. The transition was peculiar. Instead of depressing morale, the loss of the capital sparked a sense of solidarity across the country. Yes, there was embarrassment, but there was also a need to demonstrate that the US was more than a shaky democracy experiment and that it could withstand a blow. Once a cautious and frequently unpopular leader, President Madison started to gain prominence. He had vowed to restore his destroyed capital, and the picture of a beaten but determined republic struck a deep chord. They galvanized instead of humiliating, as the British had planned. Although the war was still ongoing, America had at last started to fight it with purpose and not just muskets. Baltimore was the punchback if Washington was the slap. Baltimore, a significant port city and the location of privateers who had been causing problems for British shipping, was the target of British forces shortly after the capital was set on fire. The British were confident that they would fall just as readily in Baltimore as they had in Washington. They were mistaken. Baltimore was prepared when the Redcoats arrived in the middle of September 1814. The city had been fortified day and night by locals, workers, and even slaves. Over 10,000 volunteers equipped Fort McHenry with powerful cannons, constructed mud walls, and dug trenches. This would not be another easy task. A naval bombardment from the Patapsco River and a land attack from the east comprised the traditional two-pronged British tactic. However, things took a turn for the worse very away. Early in the land fight, American sharpshooters killed General Robert Ross, the same man who had marched into Washington with great victory. His passing rocked British morale and left their leadership in disarray. At sea, the British fleet started bombarding Fort McHenry for 25 hours. The sky was striped with rockets. All night long, bombs detonated over the fort. However, the defense remained steadfast. The fort shook under the fire, but they would not give up. The morning of September 14th then arrived. The British anticipated seeing a white flag when the smoke subsided, and the harbour became quiet again. They noticed something else instead. Over the ramparts of the fort, a huge American flag was fluttering in defiance. Mary Pickersgill sewed that 30-foot-tall flag, which waved in the morning wind like a reprimand to the Empire. Francis Scott Key, an American barrister, was on a British ship observing all of this. Even though he had come to negotiate a prisoner release, he was moved to write a poem after what he witnessed that evening. Its first sentence, "Oh, say, can you see by the early light of the dawn?" The British understood that Baltimore would not surrender. Embarrassed, they pulled out. This time, American tenacity was demonstrated via trench warfare, fortitude, and a resolute refusal to back down rather than through rhetoric. The fact that Baltimore had survived restored faith in the American cause. The battle had been started by a burning capital, but the torch of identification was stoked by a fort that had been bombarded. Everything changed after Baltimore. The United States was suddenly able to maintain its position on the international scene after previously being humiliated. The British, who had anticipated a swift conclusion to the war with a crushing victory in Washington, now had to contend with mounting opposition and dwindling victories. They were slowing down their war machine. Under political pressure and logistical strain, they started to reconsider the consequences of prolonging the war. Baltimore's defense was a psychological triumph as well as a military one. It provided a foundation for American negotiators. Additionally, negotiations between American and British diplomats began a new stage in the sleepy city of Ghent, in present-day Belgium. British demands were high initially. They sought sovereignty of portions of the Great Lakes, a buffer state for Native Americans in the Midwest, and even some concessions in territory. However, American diplomats, particularly Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams, were unyielding. Instead of arguing out of despair, they did so with resilience. The British then began to blink. They were exhausted by the European War. Britain has its own internal turmoil to deal with after Napoleon. Both economies were suffering from trade disruptions. Perception had changed as a result of the Americans' successful defense of Baltimore and their refusal to surrender following Washington. It turns out that fire was not enough to win this conflict. A deal known as the Treaty of Ghent was achieved by both parties by December 24, 1814. In essence, it announced a draw. No land was transferred. No compensation was given. Not even mention was given to impressment, one of the main reasons the United States had gone to war. However, neither side was willing to concede. They therefore decided to go back to the pre-war state of affairs, or the status quo ante bellum. In an odd turn of events, the slowness of 19th century communication also contributed to one of the most significant American triumphs, the Battle of New Orleans, occurring 2 weeks after the pact was signed. However, the Americans' emotional triumph was sealed with that victory. The war ended with a mutual shrug rather than a spectacular surrender. However, it felt like something more for the U.S. They had gathered in Baltimore, escaped with their pride and sovereignty unharmed, and survived the burning of their capital. The Second War of Independence, as some would refer to it, ended abruptly. Washington's embers remained hot. However, a new American identity was emerging from those ashes. Washington's burning was more than just a military strategy. It turned into a defining trauma for the country. However, in the peculiar way that history frequently unfolds, identity, something subtly potent, was born out of that moment of complete shame. Americans had every reason to feel defeated in the immediate aftermath. Smoldering rubble was all that remained of their capital. Their president had run away. In combat, their army had fallen. However, it was not the end of the story. Actually, it was only getting started. The communal rejection to be defined by loss sprang from that devastation. It took more than just bricks and cement to rebuild Washington. It was about rebellion, remembrance, and rebirth. The White House and the new Capitol would serve as architectural icons of the nation's tenacity. Rebuilding itself served as a political statement to the globe. We remain here. And it was successful. Although the war appeared to have ended in a standoff in the minds of Americans, it took on a completely different meaning. A notion of exceptionalism started to take hold when it was believed that a young, disorganized republic could defeat the greatest empire in history and survive the experience unscathed. The United States experienced a sort of coming-of-age moment during the War of 1812, especially with regard to the destruction of its capital. Change was also compelled by it. Defense was given increasing importance by the government. Along the coasts, fortifications were strengthened. After being ignored for a long time following the Revolution, the military started to receive more strategic organization and improved resources. Civilians also viewed themselves differently, as participants in a common national experiment rather than as dispersed citizens of states. The fires left their mark on culture. More than a century later, Francis Scott Key's poem, which was influenced by the defense of Baltimore, would be adopted as the national anthem. The post-fire renovations gave rise to the term White House, which was adopted permanently. The city that initially appeared to be a failed compromise became the undeniable center of the country, and Dolly Madison's valor became a legend. Over time, even the British began to view the incident with a kind of shamed silence. They may have failed diplomatically, but they had been successful militarily. The walls could have been burnt by their fire, but the will was unharmed. Ultimately, Washington's burning wasn't merely a low point. The resilience of a republic that was yet learning how to stand was put to the test and demonstrated by the spark. And that fire, which was originally intended to be degrading, contributed to the igniting of the American spirit. In medieval Europe, a girl's path to motherhood frequently started before she had completely transitioned out of childhood. The ability of a girl to have children, particularly sons, was frequently equated with her worth, prestige, and even salvation. In the Middle Ages, becoming a mother was a social duty, but today we may consider it a biological or personal choice. Motherhood was not the only expectation placed on women, it was their destiny. The first step was marriage. Families looking to combine land, labor, or animals may organize it among peasants. Marriage was a political chess move for the nobles. By the age of 12 or 13, or occasionally even younger, a noble lady may be betrothed off. Her body swore allegiance to a future partnership. Being fertile wasn't always a good thing. It served as a negotiating chip. The urge to get pregnant started as soon as they were married. After a year or two, a wife who was unable to conceive was gossiped about, suspected, pity-moneyed, and occasionally even charged with moral or spiritual failings. A noble woman's husband might seek annulment or, worse, take a more capable mistress if she was unable to bear him a child. A woman's womb was considered a national asset by the nobles. Whether a queen could bear a healthy male heir determined whether a kingdom would rise or fall. Not only was pregnancy celebrated, but it also caused anxiety. There was a lot on the line. A male child could indicate that a dynasty would continue. A daughter? It's not ideal, but it's not worthless either. However, dynastic pressure did not lessen expectations for peasant women. Children were laborers. In addition to caring for livestock and supporting the farm, a growing family might also be able to assist the parents in their latter years. However, every pregnancy constituted a risk due to the high infant mortality rate and the lack of knowledge about maternal health. Being a mother wasn't seen as a decision. It was a calling, an expectation, and even a kind of atonement. Motherhood became both a duty and a punishment because of the Church's teaching that Eve's fall sentenced women to the agony of childbirth. Women were commended for accepting their roles without protest and for suffering in quiet. A lady who didn't have children was viewed as a failure at worst and a curiosity at best in the medieval worldview. There was no privacy in the womb. It was a combination of dynasty infrastructure, heavenly machinery, and public property. Additionally, it would define the lives and deaths of the majority of women. The lady giving birth was frequently the only soldier throughout the Middle Ages, when childbirth was a battlefield. There were no sterile devices, no white-coated doctors, and most definitely no painkillers. Instead, there were wooden stools, herbal tinctures, whispered prayers, dimly lit rooms, and a constant fear that this might be her last birth. Typically, labor was done at home. Regardless of wealth, the majority of women gave birth in the presence of other women, midwives, female relatives, and neighbors. There were very few men. In actuality, childbirth was regarded as a sacred and perilous, deeply feminine domain. Despite having no formal training, a midwife may possess some wisdom that has been passed down through the years. And there wasn't much anyone could do if something went wrong, like the baby being bred, the labor stopping, or there was bleeding. Pain was to be expected. Indeed, it was necessary from a theological standpoint. The Church taught that women were cursed to suffer during childbirth because of Eve's original sin, so enduring that pain was frequently viewed as a sign of spiritual virtue. Weeping too loudly? That could be seen as sin or worse, weakness. Some made an effort to lessen the pain. Herbal remedies derived from henbane, mandrake, or poppies might lessen the severity of the pain, but they were not always effective and could even be harmful. More often, women depended on saints, charms, and ritual. A common charm, the girdle of St. Margaret, was worn around the abdomen of a labouring woman to protect both her and the unborn child. Under the beds were holy relics. Psalms were chanted. Midwives crossed themselves before cutting the umbilical cord, and yet death lurked. Maternal mortality was tragically common. Women could die from blood loss, infection, or retained placenta days after giving birth. Some made it through labour, but later died of puerperal fever. What we now know was commonly caused by unwashed hands or soiled linens. According to estimates, the mother died in 1 out of every 10 births. The situation only got worse for low-income women who were pregnant more than once. Stillbirths, too, were frequent. Too small, too still, or too early babies. Furthermore, it produced horrifying doubts about a child's soul when they passed away without being baptized. Birth was more than just biology in this world. It was a time of danger, prayer, and penance. And each new life was born on the verge of death. The birth of a child was just the first step. Survival was the true fight for both mother and kid. The odds were harsh throughout the Middle Ages. Almost half of all children passed away before turning 5. Some never breathed for the first time. Others passed away from disease before they were even able to walk. The first year was the riskiest for a youngster. Malnutrition, diseases, and fevers were vicious killers, and medical knowledge was essentially non-existent. The brunt of this reality fell on peasant moms. They waged a daily battle against illness while living in small houses with dirt floors, surrounded by animals, and getting their water from tainted wells. Common causes of mortality were tetanus, respiratory diseases, and diarrhea. Vaccines, antibiotics, and hospitals were non-existent. Tragic events could result from even a minor fever. Noble ladies had better access to food and cleaner surroundings. However, they were not impervious. Titles meant nothing to disease, measles, smallpox, and plague. They captured both commoners and kings. In actuality, the nobles' high birth rates served purposes beyond simply bearing offspring. They have to do with statistical survival. One son was insufficient. Backups were necessary. Mothers' perceptions of their children were influenced by this harsh reality, particularly during the early years. It was not unusual for parents to wait until the child had outlived infancy before naming them. Some were reluctant to immediately develop close bonds. It's out of need, not coldness. Grief was a frequent guest. One child's burial was tragic. Burying multiple people was commonplace, yet love still existed. Desperate, painful, and fierce love. Letters, wills, prayers, and scribbles in manuscript margins all include it. We witness it when mothers bring a priest for a baptism on the deathbed or trek miles to acquire medicinal herbs. They did more than simply lament their kids. They put everything they had into the fight for them. There was a huge emotional cost. There were no bereavement counselors, no mourning leave, and no therapists. On Monday, a mother may lose a baby, and on Tuesday, she may resume her household duties. Ploughing was required in the fields. It was time to feed the fire. Whether your heart was prepared or not, life went on. Hope and heartache coexisted in medieval parenting. All births were miracles. Every survival is a tiny act of resistance to the overwhelming odds. Motherhood was political as well as personal for noble women. The womb of a noblewoman was a royal asset, a tool for succession planning, dynasties, and alliances. Every child, particularly a son, was either a public failure or a strategic triumph, and her pregnancies were monitored with greater ferocity than most medieval conflicts. There was a great deal of pressure. A noblewoman's only responsibility from the time of marriage was to bear heirs, not just any children, but legal, healthy male offspring. If a queen didn't, she might be discarded. Kings may look for mistresses, annulments, or even new spouses. Ask Catherine of Aragon or Anne of Bohemia. Not only was a barren noblewoman pitiable, but she also had little political value. The mother's task did not end with the birth of her children. She took on the role of nervous watchdog. The children were not necessarily raised by her. Tutors, governesses, and wet nurses were usually in charge of providing daily care. However, she was supposed to oversee their schooling, ensure their futures, and hawkishly protect their reputations. Future monarchs' mothers frequently had to put up with constant manipulation, factional politics, and court gossip. Before they could walk, their sons were pawns, and before they could talk, they were engaged. What about daughters? As teenagers, they were frequently transported to foreign courts as marriage chips, sometimes never to return. However, noble mums weren't necessarily ornamental or aloof. Some people used their kids to gain a great deal of power. In addition to giving birth to kings, Eleanor of Aquitaine counselled, corrected, and even rebelled against one in one instance. To protect her son's crown, Margaret of Anjou raised armies. In the name of her son, Isabella of France planned her husband's deposition. These mothers weren't passive. These were political agents dressed in lace and velvet. There was heartbreak as well as motherhood, exile, sickness, assassinations, and stillbirths. Children of royalty were far from secure. The game becomes more deadly as the rank increases. Noble mothers were emotionally tense all the time. Although they lacked agency, they did have prestige. Their genuine love for their kids was frequently entwined with obligation. For the sake of their home, they were supposed to give up their bodies, their privacy, and even their maternal instincts. The stark, unrelenting, and unromantic responsibility of existence fell on peasant mothers if the weight of dynasties fell on noble women. Motherhood was life itself for the medieval peasant woman, not just a phase of life. It rarely provided rest in between, started young, and concluded late. These ladies were almost always pregnant throughout their 20s and 30s, and they usually got married in their mid-teens. Pregnancy was an almost constant condition since there was no access to effective birth control, and the Church strongly opposed all forms of contraception. Every new baby meant another mouth to feed and possibly another set of hands to till the soil. Without access to clean linens, doctors, or privacy, peasant women gave birth at home. A nearby midwife may or may not help. Some women gave birth in fields or barns by themselves, went back to work within hours, and prayed they wouldn't bleed out in the open. It was not unusual for someone to die during or after childbirth, and no one apologized. Life was harsh, quick, and heartless. The instant the umbilical cord was severed, child-rearing began. The concept of maternity leave did not exist. Babies were swaddled tightly and either left in cradles by hearth fires, watched over by older siblings or not at all, or carried on the mother's body while she worked. They didn't encourage crying. The sound was assimilated into the cadence of everyday labor. Mothers demonstrated to their children how to weed gardens, gather firewood, patch clothing, and feed hens. It was expected of even toddlers to carry messages or bring water. All the kids had to pitch in. There was no such thing as childhood as we know it, innocent, safe, stuffed with toys and education. Nevertheless, there was love in spite of the difficulties. As they snuggled their children next to them on communal straw mattresses, mothers muttered prayers, braided their daughters' hair, and sung lullabies. Food, warmth, and sacrifice were all ways that love was shown. A mother walking barefoot to let her son to use her only pair of shoes to church, or a mother sharing her share of bread with a starving child. Motherhood among the peasantry was an endurance masterclass. In addition to bearing children, these women also bore loads, firewood, loss, and expectations. Even after they buried a kid, their backs bowed under the weight of a world that never stopped, and yet they continued. In the medieval age, a baby's diet was determined by both biology and social status. Breastfeeding was an absolute need for the majority of moms, particularly those in rural areas. It was anticipated, natural, and essential to survival. Animal milk was dangerous and frequently tainted, and there was no such thing as formula. The only lifeline was the body of a mother. Because they were forced to, peasant mothers breastfed their children for as long as they could, frequently well into toddlerhood. In addition to providing nutrition, breastfeeding served as a kind of crude birth control, postponing the return of fertility just enough to be a kind gesture in a society where pregnancies are almost inevitable. Between planting and harvesting, these ladies would stop to feed the babies strapped on their backs as they worked the fields. However, in aristocratic homes, the regulations were altered. Breastfeeding was frequently viewed by upper-class women as beneath their station, emotionally awkward, physically taxing, and culturally inappropriate for a lady of refinement. The wet nurse comes in. These were lower-class women who were paid to breastfeed aristocratic infants full-time after being chosen for their health and milk production. They developed strong maternal ties, often much stronger than those between a mother and her kid, and frequently lived with the child. This caused the church to feel conflicted. Some theologians were concerned that a kid who was breastfed by a woman who lacked moral integrity might inherit her transgressions. Wet nurses, according to some, were a practical need for women who needed to continue being fertile and bearing children. A queen, after all, had to be pregnant with her next child and could not afford to waste time nursing her first. Even the care of infants was harsh by today's standards. Swaddling was almost universal. To train them not to move too much and to straighten their limbs, babies were wrapped firmly in fabric. There were diapers, but they were rarely changed and were typically made from repurposed rags or cloth lined with moss. There were few baths. Charms or traditional cures were used to treat teething. If there were cribs at all, they were harsh. Babies and their parents frequently shared a bed, which raised the possibility of unintentional suffocation. The sickness came on fast. Herbal infusions, prayers, and saints were among the remedies. Additionally, some people thought that a child's death, particularly during infancy, was God's will or, worse, a punishment for the mother's transgressions. Mothers, however, did their best. They sung lullabies in long-lost tongues, rocked, calmed, and fed. Even in the shadows and dirt of medieval life, love found a way. Motherhood in medieval Europe was both physical and spiritual labor. The experience of pregnancy, childbirth, and parenthood was tightly controlled by the church. Religious significance permeated every aspect of life, from conception to burial, and a mother's soul was always being examined. Women frequently looked to saints for protection before giving birth. Pregnant women particularly favored Saint Margaret of Antioch. According to legend, she could shield them during labor since she had once survived a dragon's stomach. Her name was murmured during contractions, her image was worn on tokens, and her prayers were recited. The church believed that childbirth was corrupted by sin. Women were taught that labor discomfort was a penance for humanity's initial fall because of the narrative of Eve. Therefore, a woman was reminded of her inherent guilt even during the most joyous occasion, the birth of a child. She also ran the prospect of spiritual danger if she passed away during childbirth without confessing. Baptism was the next crucial step after the infant was delivered. There was a genuine fear of limbo. Many people thought that a child's soul would not be allowed to enter heaven if they passed away before being baptized. When a newborn was too ill to wait for a priest, midwives were occasionally permitted to administer emergency baptisms. Though terrifying, the notion of a newborn being condemned to eternal damnation was not unusual in medieval theology. Where doctrine failed, superstition filled the void. Mothers drew protective symbols in ashes on the floor, draped herbs above doorways, or fastened charms to cradles. Miscarriages or unwell babies were attributed to demonic spirits, bad fairies, and the evil eye. In order to stave off spirits that might try to take their infants away, some mothers would recite secret names for them. After birth, the church also controlled how women were reintegrated into society. The churching ceremony served as a sort of ceremonial purification and was often held 40 days following delivery. Up until that point, a mother was required to avoid public worship because she was viewed as spiritually impure. In addition to welcoming her back and blessing her, the ceremony served as a subtly critical reminder. Despite being necessary, childbirth left a taint. Many women took solace in their faith despite the harsh doctrine. Between the Psalms and the suffering, prayer provided protection, ritual provided certainty, and hope existed. The third stage of medieval motherhood, which involved molding a person who could endure in a harsh environment, started when a child made it through infancy. And this required hard realities, discipline, and frequently early separation. Education for peasant women focused on survival skills rather than books. Children were expected to help from the time they could walk. Girls assisted with carrying water, feeding hens, and gathering firewood. Boys learnt to follow their dads in the fields, swing tools, and care for animals. The earliest educators were mothers who taught their kids how to spin wool, bake dough, or repair a shabby tunic. Like heirlooms, the lessons were immediate, applicable, and transmitted. The sternness of the discipline was not always brutal. Strictness was a sign of affection in a society where disobedience could result in death. A wandering youngster could be booted by a horse or drown in a well. Both rewards and corporal punishment were prevalent. A warm supper, a forehead kiss, and a hearth song. Correction was frequently accompanied with affection. Education was distinct among the nobility. Frequently, before they turned 10, boys were sent off to train as squires or pages. Girls were occasionally sent to convents or aristocratic homes to study needlework, manners, and the subtleties of courtly conduct. This required noble mothers to give up their children at a young age, sometimes never to raise them again. That did not imply that they were unconcerned. Noble women's letters showed a great deal of worry for the reputations, marriages, and health of their offspring. Despite not putting her child to bed every night, a noble mother was frequently working behind the scenes, planning their futures like a chess master. Nevertheless, separation has a genuine emotional cost. By the age of 15, children may be married off, nursed by others, and raised by strangers. It's possible for a mother to learn of her child's passing by messenger or not. Nevertheless, mums in the Middle Ages managed to maintain their bonds through customs, prayers, and mementos. They ingrained themselves into the lives of their children, whether they lived nearby or far away, by passing down songs, names, and customs. Holding on was not the goal of medieval motherhood. It involved getting ready to let go, early, frequently, and without assurance. Rarely did mothers in the Middle Ages leave written records. They didn't write books or keep diaries. However, their imprints can be seen in the prayers etched into chapel walls, the lullabies that have endured, the customs that have been passed down, and the bones of the kids they reared in spite of all the odds. Our love was different from theirs. There were no ultrasound pictures on the wall or baby showers. Quiet and pragmatic, affection was frequently concealed by the need to maintain emotional distance. After all, to love sincerely was to risk destruction at a time when so many children perished young. Mothers did, however, love passionately, patiently, and without hesitation. Traces of that love can be found in the margins of medieval texts, where a woman wrote the name of her lost child next to a prayer, in letters from queens pleading for updates on their children, in the worn shoes found on graves, and in folk tales where mothers sacrificed themselves to ensure the safety of their children. Neither of them were signs of weakness. In a world that continuously challenges the strength of mothers, they were acts of rebellion. A constant companion was loss, war, plagues, fevers, and stillbirths. A mother may bury 6 and raise 10, The mourning was quiet and intimate, but it lasted a lifetime. Though it wasn't always spoken, grief was constantly present, and they persisted. They gave birth without any medication. They suffered the agony of losing kid after child and the embarrassment of being infertile. They faced the pressures of society, the scrutiny of the church, and the limitations of their own bodies. Some suffered from malnutrition, poverty, or exile. Others suffered from husband abuse. Nevertheless, they raised, guarded, instructed, and, most amazingly, hoped throughout it all. Their legacy is recorded in next generations rather than in stone monuments. They are the anonymous forebears who provided for our needs, clothing, food, and somehow making it all work. Despite the odds against them, they laid the groundwork for survival and family. Motherhood in the Middle Ages wasn't gentle or holy. It was courageous, difficult, emotional, and complex. It was always essential, occasionally happy, and frequently heartbreaking. These ladies were the quiet creators of the medieval world in every way. Even if history hardly ever inscribed their names on its walls, their sacrifices, labor-formed kingdoms, and decisions fashioned futures continue to reverberate in our hearts long after the cradles were empty and the prayers had ceased. Humanity gazed up at the night sky with awe, and very few instruments long before we ever saw the moons of Jupiter or the rings of Saturn. They marked the seasons and mapped the planets beforehand, but they did it all with their unaided eyes. Even if that eye is amazing, it has its limitations. The sky was more often interpreted than researched for the majority of human history. Constellations were transformed into myths by ancient cultures. Scorpio was a god-sent scorpion, while Orion was a hunter. Because they moved in a different way than fixed stars, the Greeks called wandering lights planets or wanderers. However, nobody quite understood what they were. Were they heavenly lamps, crystal spheres, or fiery chariots? There was no way for anyone to investigate further. To observe was to stand beneath the stars and note what was visible. Islamic astronomers created instruments such as the astrolabe, which made it possible to trace celestial motion with startling accuracy. The Mayans and Babylonians forecasted eclipses and maintained exact calendars. To determine the locations of the planets, the Greeks constructed intricate mechanical systems such as the Antikythera mechanism. However, no one was able to see farther than the eye could. Thus, space continued to be more of a mystery than a reality. At best, the concept of enhancing vision was intriguing. Reflection was comprehended. There were mirrors. However, the phenomenon of light bending via a lens, known as refraction, was still not fully understood. Optics was a young science, and no one had yet thought to apply it to the stars. More significantly, nobody thought that the sky itself would alter. It was believed that the heavens were flawless, timeless, and unalterable. The world of divine order, according to Aristotle. In comparison, the earth was chaotic and corrupt. For generations, scientific advancement was impeded by this idea. Why construct a tool to test what you previously thought was perfect? Nevertheless, the necessity persisted, hidden behind the questions that people continued to pose. What is the composition of the stars? What causes certain lights to move while others do not? Is Earth really the center of the universe? Above a planet that lacked the means to look outside its borders, all those questions lingered without answers. No, until a curious Dutchman, glassmakers, and tinkerers changed everything. Ancient people were already bending light, albeit unintentionally, long before anybody ever imagined looking into the heavens. Actually, the first lenses were probably unintentional. When properly structured, transparent crystals like beryl or quartz may naturally magnify objects. Occasionally, something intriguing would emerge from these stones that had been smoothed and polished by nature or by man. When viewed through them, objects appeared larger. It must have appeared like magic to our ancestors. The Nimrud lens, a fragment of rock crystal that may have been used to concentrate or magnify light, was created by the Assyrians by the 1st millennium BCE. Its precise function is up for discussion. Was it only ornamental or a component of a scientific instrument? In any case, it demonstrates one thing. People had begun to realize that light could be controlled. Reading stones, which are hemispherical pieces of glass that are placed directly over texts to expand the letters underneath, first appeared in ancient Rome. They were a direct link in the evolutionary chain of optics and the forerunners of magnifying glasses. These instruments provided humans with a clue, but they did not explore the sky. It's possible to improve sight. However, the Islamic Golden Age, rather than Rome, was when the true breakthrough occurred. Ibn al-Haytham, often called Al-Hazn in the West, was a polymath who transformed the study of light in the 10th and 11th century. His work established the principle of how telescopes will eventually function, even if he wasn't really building any. Al-Hazn experimented with water, mirrors, and glass to learn how light bent and traveled. He suggested that light entered the eyes rather than vision being sent out from them, as many people thought. This idea is so clear now that it's difficult to imagine it was controversial at one point. Centuries before Europe would rediscover the study of light, his book of optics established the fundamentals of refraction and reflection. These intellectuals created the theoretical framework for later inventors, even if they never used their theories to study the stars. After being translated into Latin, their works proliferated throughout medieval Europe, laying the groundwork for the Renaissance's revolutionary optical experiments. The study of optics had subtly infiltrated daily life by the 13th century, not through astronomy but through a far more intimate problem: poor vision. Glassmakers started creating lenses to aid elderly monks and scholars in reading their manuscripts in the busy workshops of Italy, especially in the area surrounding Venice. The outcome? Wonders. Around 1285, spectacles first arose, most likely in Venice or Pisa. Simple convex lenses with metal or wood frames were made to balance precariously on the nose. Arms to hook behind the ears were absent, as were temples. Users only needed to hold them up by hand or pinch them into position. However, the outcome was revolutionary. People were finally able to combat their deteriorating vision. Reading glasses quickly gained favor, particularly among the educated elite and clergy. Scripture reading was now possible for monks well into old age. Texts may be studied late into the night by scholars. Despite their ignorance of the physics behind their products, glassmakers had discovered a thriving industry. Nevertheless, a notion was ingrained in the public consciousness by this new fixation on magnifying. Could glass let us see farther if it could help us notice the small? It wasn't an instant leap. Making spectacles to let people see books and thread needles was a craft that persisted for centuries. Convex and concave lens knowledge, however, gradually advanced in the background. Artists started experimenting with the forms of lenses. Ancient Arabic works on refraction were copied and expanded upon by scholars. Tinkering grew more aspirational. This fire was fueled by the Renaissance's obsession with rediscovery and reinvention. In order to achieve true innovation, experimenters started combining lenses, sometimes for pleasure and other times for other purposes. Finally, someone discovered a configuration that performed an unanticipated action. It drew things closer from a distance. According to the majority of accounts, that someone was the Dutch spectacle maker Hans Lippershey, who in 1608 put together a device that could magnify distant objects. Although it wasn't flawless, it was effective. The spyglass was the name given to his creation, a straightforward tube with two lenses. It might transform navigation, combat, and soon the universe. However, it wouldn't be Lippershey who would turn it to the stars. A different kind of mind, one that is unafraid to defy the skies and combines elements of showmanship and science, would be required for that. One guy saw a means to question the basic foundation of the universe when word of Hans Lippershey's spyglass reached Italy. That guy was Galileo Galilei, a Pisan math professor who had a penchant for experimenting and a strong mistrust of conventional wisdom. When he learned about the Dutch gadget in 1609, he intended to make it better rather than merely imitate it. He constructed his own telescope in a matter of months, initially with a 3x magnification, followed by an 8x and a 20x shortly after. Galileo turned his telescope at the sky, which was longer, sharper, and more sophisticated than Lippershey's cumbersome instrument. It was a historic occasion. Galileo was the first person to actually glimpse the heavens via his own homemade optics. The fragile, divine purity that Aristotle taught and the Church upheld was destroyed by what he discovered. For example, the moon wasn't a smooth, bright ball. Galileo observed mountains, craters, and flaws. The Milky Way was composed of innumerable stars, not a milky smear. 4 of Jupiter's moons orbited the planet like tiny celestial satellites, despite the fact that it was believed to be merely another wandering light. We now refer to them as the Galilean moons, Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto, but he called them the Medicean stars after his benefactors. Most startling of all, Venus orbited the Sun, not Earth, because it had phases like the Moon. Galileo stabbed the traditional geocentric concept in the heart with each observation. It appeared that everything was not centered on the Earth. No one had anticipated how vast, bizarre, and vibrant the universe was. In 1610, Galileo's research was published in Sidereus Nuncius, the celestial messenger. It was a heavenly tell-all, a feeling. His telescope drew large crowds. He was commended by academics. The Church became uncomfortable, because this was no longer merely a scientific instrument. The telescope was now a threat. It provided proof that went against centuries of theological belief. Once believed to be unchangeable and divine, the sky today appeared cluttered, dynamic, and ever-changing. In addition to creating astronomy, Galileo weaponized vision and sparked a conflict between belief and observation with a few polished lenses. Never again would the stars be quiet or safe. Galileo had demonstrated the capabilities of 2 lenses in a tube, but his Galilean design, one concave at the eyepiece and one convex at the front, had limitations. Pale magnification, hazy edges, and a limited range of view after you went beyond 30x. Here comes the German mathematician Johannes Kepler, who is already well known for his planetary motion rules. In 1610, Kepler posed a straightforward query while reading the starry messenger. Is it possible to improve the visuals? He created Dioptris, a treatise that revised the lens code in less than a year. Kepler suggested using the second convex lens in place of Galileo's concave eyepiece. The payoff was enormous, yet the image would turn upside down. Greater focus, a broader field, and potentially infinite magnification. The apparatus was never developed by Kepler himself. Throughout his life he had to balance family sorrow, pestilence, and patronage, but his patterns spread like illegal goods throughout Europe. Tinkerers grabbed hold of the concept. Francesco Fontana claimed 160x power while creating large, cumbersome instruments in Italy, some of which were 6 meters long. Later, Christian Huygens and his brother would extend the distance beyond 30 meters in the Netherlands in order to search for Saturn's rings. However, the Jesuit astronomer Christoph Scheiner is said to have constructed the first confirmed Keplerian telescopes in the 1630s. He showed one to the emperor in Vienna, illuminating courtiers on far-off church towers with spies angled right, but all upside down. Clarity came at a minor cost with the inverted perspective, but it also opened up a new market for eyepieces and ingenious mirror diagonals for viewing from the ground. London and Parisian artisans fought to sell terrestrial versus astronomical models. No longer considered scientific marvels, telescopes were instead luxuries owned by aristocrats who wished to boast about having spotted ships before they arrived at port. In the meantime, genuine science was kindled by Kepler's optics. Astronomers were able to map lunar valleys, draw sunspots, and time Jupiter's moons with such accuracy that they suggested utilizing them as celestial clocks for longitude, thanks to improved photographs. The telescope was changing from a disruptive device to a necessary tool. However, tubes sagged and glass blurred with each additional inch of focal length. There was a competition for longer-powered, shorter telescopes. That task would call forth a genius named Isaac Newton, who liked apples and detested chromatic stains. Though it was simply changing form, the weapons race of vision was far from over. The refracting telescope had grown to ridiculous size by the middle of the 1800s. Astronomers were constructing scopes longer than houses, some more than 100 feet, in an effort to improve magnification and overcome the annoying defect known as chromatic aberration. The smear that leaked around bright things was rainbow-colored. Colors split like a prism when light traveled through bent lenses, producing hazy halos. The colors would not behave no matter how finely a lens was crafted. This brings us to Isaac Newton, a guy who not only recognized the issue, but also refused to accept it. Already renowned for his work in calculus and physics, Newton focused his razor-sharp mind on optics. His remedy? Give up wearing lenses completely. In 1668, Newton introduced something startling, the reflecting telescope. He collected and focused light using a curved mirror rather than bending it through glass. Mirrors didn't split light into rainbows. They didn't need to be hundreds of feet long. The best part is that they might be brief, strong, and accurate. Newton's design featured a concave primary mirror at the bottom of the tube, which reflected light to a flat diagonal mirror, then into the eyepiece situated on the side. Although it didn't resemble Galileo's spyglass, it was functional. The image was clear, sharp, and, above all, color-distorted free. Newton initially kept his idea a secret. He wasn't fond of public drama. However, when he brought the telescope to the Royal Society in 1672, it created a commotion. This little device performed better than refractors that were many times its size. Now, from a backyard rather than a cathedral rooftop, observers could examine the rocky lunar surface, Saturn's rings, and Jupiter's belts in breathtaking detail. Still, the reflecting telescope came with its own issues. It was challenging to create a mirror that was completely parabolic. The shiny metal used in the early models corroded easily and required frequent repolishing. However, the fundamental concept was groundbreaking, and its promise was indisputable. Although it didn't completely replace refractors, Newton's invention revolutionized the telescope. Two opposing avenues, lenses, or mirrors were now available to astronomers. Newton's silent revolt would also change the basic structure of astronomy as mirror technology advanced. The cosmos hadn't altered, but the way we saw it just made a leap ahead. By the 18th century, telescopes had escaped the hands of individual tinkerers and entered the age of national pride, royal patronage, and scientific ambition. The telescope was no longer just a great invention, it was now a weapon in the quest to understand the universe, and across Europe astronomers were wielding it like never before. This time period is dominated by one name: William Herschel. Herschel, a self-taught astronomer who was born in Germany, settled in England and developed a fascination with the night sky. With the help of his clever sister, Caroline Herschel, he began erecting gigantic reflecting telescopes in his backyard, melting metal, casting mirrors, grinding lenses by hand. One of his designs had a mirror that was 4 feet broad and more than 40 feet long. It was the largest telescope in the world at the time. He created history with it. In 1781, Herschel discovered Uranus, the first new planet found since ancient times. It rocked astronomy to its core. The solar system suddenly grew larger than anyone had anticipated. There was more to Herschel. He created the term galaxy, catalogued nebula, and plotted thousands of stars. He thought that some of the hazy clouds he could see with his telescope might be whole island worlds that are very different from our own. In the meantime, Caroline rose to prominence as a solo astronomer. Working tirelessly alongside her brother in the observatory, she published groundbreaking catalogues, improved star charts, and found multiple comets. In other places, the telescope was also assisting researchers in solving enduring mysteries. Astronomers used it to follow transits of Venus, measuring the Earth's distance from the Sun. Telescopic observations enhanced celestial navigation, allowing ships to navigate oceans with significantly greater precision. The sky was literally the lifeblood of naval powers. Additionally, achromatic refractors, which used unique lens combinations to eliminate chromatic aberration, were now generally available, although Newton's reflectors remained elite devices. John Dolland and other optometrists improved lenses to provide the best of both worlds, color correction and clarity, while avoiding rainbow streaks. Observatories were being established around Europe, Paris, Berlin, Greenwich. The field of astronomy was institutionalized. In addition to academics' attics, telescopes were also found in towers, domes, and royal homes. They had come to represent empire and enlightenment. This was the golden age of stargazing, when the telescope wasn't simply enlarging our vision, but our entire place in the cosmos. The telescope entered its industrial phase at the start of the 19th century. What started off as handcrafted glass and brass tubes evolved into intricately designed steel, bronze, and cast-iron instruments. The sky, once traced by candles, was now being charted by the expanding strength of industry, railroads, and empire. The largest change? Dimensions. The size of telescopes was growing. The greatest telescope in the world at the time was built in Ireland by William Parsons, the 3rd Earl of Ross, a wealthy astronomer. The Leviathan of Parsonstown, which was finished in 1845, had a tube that was 50 feet long and a mirror that was 6 feet in diameter. Suspended between two gigantic brick walls, it appeared more like a siege weapon than a scientific equipment. However, it was successful. Using it, Parsons made one of the earliest drawings that resembled a spiral galaxy and observed the structure of what was then known as the Whirlpool Nebula, now known as M51. He had no way of knowing how far away it truly was, but the drawing alone implied that the universe might be full of systems like our own, well beyond the Milky Way. In the meantime, further observatories appeared in America, France, and Russia. Astronomers were now paid researchers with support, funding, and government grants, rather than isolated geniuses in disguise. Telescopes started heading west in search of higher elevations, clearer skies, and drier air. The Lick Observatory in California, which was constructed in 1888 on Mount Hamilton, was one of the most well-known. With a 36-inch objective lens, it held the biggest refracting telescope ever built. In 1897, the Wisconsin-based Yerkes Observatory followed suit with an even longer refractor that remains the largest of its kind to this day. Refractors, however, were getting close to their limit. Under their own weight, the lenses drooped. It was impossible to cast or support glass this large precisely. Mirrors were mentioned in the future once more. Because silver-coated glass was lighter and easier to maintain than Newton's metal mirrors, engineers started experimenting with it. Reflectors were making a resurgence after being eclipsed by their relatives with lenses. Photography came into play at the same time. For the first time, telescopes could record the skies in addition to observing them. In order to view farther than ever before, astronomers started taking long exposure pictures of planets, stars, and nebula. The era of observation was coming to an end. The era of data had arrived. The telescope changed from being an instrument for vision to a device for revelation as the 20th century progressed. The mysteries that the visible light had always kept from humans were revealed when telescopes started gathering data across the electromagnetic spectrum, not just what the human eye could perceive. When George Ellery Hale led the development of the Hooker telescope, which was finished in 1917, The revolution got its start atop Mount Wilson in California. It was the most potent telescope available at the time, with a 100-inch mirror. And Edwin Hubble, a young astronomer, gazed into the mirror. Hubble examined the Andromeda Nebula in the 1920s with the Hooker. Everything changed when he found out. Andromeda was one of millions of galaxies, not just a cloud inside our own. The notion of a small, static cosmos was disproved by Hubble's research. It turned out that the universe was enormous, growing, and incredibly old. The atmosphere soon became a constraint as well. Much of the electromagnetic spectrum was obscured by Earth's air, which also distorted starlight. Thus, telescopes started to ascend higher in the second half of the century, entering balloons, airplanes, and eventually orbit. The Hubble Space Telescope, a namesake tribute, was launched by NASA in 1990 and is currently orbiting above Earth's warped atmosphere. After an initial snag with its mirror, Hubble went on to give the finest detailed photographs of the universe ever captured. Gas pillars, dying stars, and young galaxies. It gazed farther into the past than any human eye could. Hubble was only the first step. Scientists were able to listen to space thanks to radio telescopes like the Very Large Array in New Mexico and those at Arecibo. Cool, obscure objects covered in cosmic dust were discovered by infrared telescopes. Black holes were seen consuming stuff by X-ray telescopes. A fresh stratum of the universe was unveiled by each new kind of telescope. Next came the 2021 launch of the James Webb Space Telescope. Designed to view back more than 13 billion years to the beginning of galaxy creation, it is far more sensitive than Hubble. A time machine made of intricate mathematics and gold mirrors, not just an eye in the sky. The telescope has developed into a tool of pure wonder, from Galileo's unsteady wooden tube to spacefaring observatories cooled by liquid helium. We now decipher the cosmos rather than merely seeing it. And we get one step closer to the answer to the initial question, with every new lens, mirror, or frequency that is unlocked. Is there anything else out there?